The clock struck 11:30 p.m. at Boston General Hospital as Dr. Marcus Thompson finished writing his final notes for the day. His dark eyes were tired but satisfied after completing a challenging 14-hour emergency surgery. At 45 years old, he was one of the hospital's top neurosurgeons, known for taking on the most difficult cases that other doctors wouldn't touch. The hospital corridors were quiet as he walked toward the elevator. A few nurses waved at him, and one called out, "Good night, Dr. Thompson. Amazing work today." He smiled and waved back, his white coat swaying as he walked. The emergency surgery had saved a young mother's life, and that made all the exhaustion worth it. In the doctor's lounge, Marcus changed out of his surgical scrubs into his regular clothes, a crisp blue button-down shirt, black dress pants, and his favorite navy blue tie. He always dressed professionally, something his father had taught him years ago. "Son," his father used to say, "in this world, you got to look twice as sharp to get half the respect." Those words had stuck with him throughout his career. As he picked up his briefcase from his office, Marcus looked at the family photos on his desk. There was one of him with his wife Lisa at their wedding, another of their two children, Michael, 12, and Sarah, 8, at the beach last summer, and a recent photo of his parents at their 50th wedding anniversary. He smiled, thinking about how proud they were when he became chief of neurosurgery last year. The parking garage was almost empty when Marcus walked to his car. His footsteps echoed against the concrete walls as he approached his black BMW 7 Series. The car had been his one big splurge after getting promoted, though Lisa had teased him about it being his midlife crisis purchase. He chuckled at the memory as he put his briefcase in the passenger seat. The streets of Boston were peaceful at this hour. Marcus took his usual route home, driving through downtown where the city lights sparkled against the night sky. He thought about his schedule for tomorrow, 2 planned surgeries and a meeting with medical students who were eager to learn from him. Teaching the next generation of doctors was one of his favorite parts of the job. As he turned onto the highway, Marcus called Lisa using his car's hands-free system. "Hey honey," he said when she answered. "I'm finally heading home." "You must be exhausted," Lisa replied, her voice warm with concern. "How did the surgery go?" "It was tough, but we saved her." Young mother of 3. She had a brain aneurysm that could have burst at any moment. He smiled as he changed lanes. "We got to her just in time." "That's wonderful, Marcus." The kids waited up as long as they could to say goodnight. "Sarah left you a drawing on the kitchen table. Tell them I'll make it up to them this weekend. Maybe we can go to that new science museum they've been talking about." After saying goodbye to Lisa, Marcus turned on some soft jazz, his favorite way to unwind after a long day. The music of Miles Davis filled the car as he drove through his upscale neighborhood, Ridgewood Heights. The streets were lined with beautiful colonial-style homes and well-maintained lawns. After 15 years of hard work, he and Lisa had finally bought their dream house here 3 years ago. Marcus was thinking about tomorrow's surgeries when he noticed a police cruiser in his rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding, and he'd been careful to signal all his turns, so he didn't think much of it. But then another police car appeared, and suddenly their lights started flashing. "That's strange," he thought, checking his speed again. He was only 5 minutes from home, driving exactly at the speed limit. Following proper procedure, he put on his turn signal and pulled over to the side of the road, making sure to stop under a street light for better visibility. As he waited for the officers to approach, Marcus took a deep breath and placed his hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. Years of experience had taught him exactly how to handle these situations, though he never thought he'd have to use those lessons in his own neighborhood. Little did he know, this regular evening was about to turn into something that would change not just his life, but his entire community. Marcus Thompson sat perfectly still in his BMW, hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel. The red and blue lights from the police cars flashed brightly in his mirrors, lighting up the quiet neighborhood street. He could see his house just 3 doors down, so close, yet now feeling very far away. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicles, hands already resting on their weapons. In his rearview mirror, Marcus could see them approaching his car from both sides, flashlights beam cutting through the darkness. His heart began to beat faster, but his face remained calm. Years of performing complex surgeries had taught him how to stay steady under pressure. "Driver, turn off your engine and throw your keys out the window," the officer on the driver's side shouted. His voice was much louder than necessary for the quiet street. Marcus did exactly as he was told. He switched off the engine, carefully removed his keys from the ignition, and tossed them onto the street through his slightly opened window. The keys landed with a quiet jingle on the asphalt. Now put both hands back on the steering wheel where we can see them, the second officer commanded from the passenger side. The flashlights were so bright that Marcus could barely see the officers' faces. He noticed movement in nearby houses, lights turning on, curtains moving. His neighbors were watching. Some had come out onto their porches, holding phones up to record what was happening. "Officers," Marcus said calmly, keeping his hands visible, "may I ask why I've been stopped?" "Shut up," the first officer snapped. "Your vehicle matches the description of one used in a robbery 30 minutes ago. Black male driving a black luxury vehicle." Marcus felt a familiar weight in his chest. A description that could match thousands of cars and drivers had somehow led these officers to him, just blocks from his own home. He thought about his briefcase on the passenger seat, containing his hospital ID and medical license. If he could just show them. "Step out of the vehicle slowly, keeping your hands where we can see them," the first officer ordered. "Officer, I live just 3 houses down," Marcus tried to explain. "I'm a surgeon at Boston General. My ID is right here in my—" "I said step out of the vehicle, do not reach for anything." Marcus knew better than to argue. Very slowly, he unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the car door with his left hand, keeping his right hand visible on the steering wheel. As he stepped out, the cool night air hit his face. He could hear whispers from the growing crowd of neighbors. "Is that Dr. Thompson? What are they doing to him? Someone should call Lisa." "Turn around and put your hands on the hood," the officer commanded. Marcus complied, the metal of his car still warm under his palms. He was wearing his best dress shirt and tie, the same clothes he'd worn earlier that day while saving a woman's life in the operating room. Now he stood like a criminal, spotlighted by police flashlights in front of his own neighbors. "Spread your legs." The officer kicked Marcus's feet further apart while his partner kept watch. More police cars were arriving now. Marcus could hear their sirens in the distance, getting closer. The quiet street where his children played basketball and rode their bikes was turning into a scene from the evening news. "Please," Marcus said steadily, "my hospital ID is in my briefcase. I just finished a 14-hour surgery. I'm Dr. Marcus Thompson, Chief of Neurosurgery at Boston General." "Yeah, and I'm the President of the United States," the officer replied sarcastically. "We've heard every story in the book. You match the description, and that's all we need to know right now." Marcus felt cold metal against his wrists as handcuffs clicked into place. The same hands that had performed delicate brain surgery just hours ago were now being locked behind his back. He could see Mrs. Chen from next door holding her phone up, recording everything. Her face showed the same shock he'd seen on his patients' families when they received bad news. More red and blue lights appeared at the end of the street. A third police car was pulling up, and with it, a turn of events that would change everything about this night. Standing handcuffed beside his BMW, Marcus Thompson felt the eyes of his entire neighborhood on him. The number of onlookers had grown, with more neighbors emerging from their homes into the chilly night air. Some were still in their pajamas, phones held up to record the scene. The red and blue lights from multiple police cars turned his peaceful street into something that looked like a crime scene. "Walk towards the police car," the first officer ordered, gripping Marcus's arm tightly. As they moved, Marcus saw his next-door neighbor, Tom Wilson, trying to approach the officers. Tom was waving his hands, attempting to get their attention. "Officers, there's been a mistake. That's Dr. Thompson. He lives right there." Tom pointed toward Marcus's house. "Sir, stay back," another officer warned Tom. "This is a police matter. Return to your house immediately." The growing crowd of neighbors became more vocal. Marcus could hear their protests mixing with the crackling of police radios and the idle engines of patrol cars. "This is ridiculous. We see him every day. He saved my sister's life last year." Marcus kept his voice steady despite the situation. "Officers, please listen. My wife Lisa is a law professor at Boston University. She's probably watching this right now. Just let me prove who I am. My hospital ID and license are in my briefcase." The first officer ignored his words and started walking him toward the patrol car. Marcus could feel the rough grip on his arm tightening. His expensive dress shoes crunched against the gravel on the road's shoulder, the same road where he usually took morning walks with his wife. Suddenly, the front door of his house burst open. Lisa Thompson ran out, still wearing her reading glasses and holding her phone. Their two children appeared behind her in the doorway, but she quickly told them to stay inside. "Marcus," she called out, her voice strong and clear. "Don't say anything else. I'm calling Dane Williams from the law school right now." "Ma'am, stay back," an officer warned, moving to block her path. "This is an active investigation." Lisa stood her ground, her phone to her ear. "I'm watching you violate my husband's civil rights. He's the chief of neurosurgery at Boston General Hospital. Whatever you think he's done, you've made a massive mistake." The situation was getting more tense by the second. Marcus could hear his children crying from the doorway of their home. Sarah, his 8-year-old daughter, was calling out for him. The sound broke his heart, but he knew he had to stay calm. One wrong move, one angry word, and things could get much worse. More neighbors had gathered now, forming small groups on their front lawns. Mrs. Chen, who had been recording everything, was explaining to others what she'd seen. Some were making phone calls. Marcus could hear them trying to reach people who might be able to help. "Check his briefcase," someone shouted from the crowd. "His ID is right there in the car." The second officer finally walked over to the passenger side of Marcus's BMW and shone his flashlight through the window. The black leather briefcase sat exactly where Marcus had left it, with his hospital ID tag clearly visible on the handle. "We'll get to that," the first officer said dismissively. "Right now, we need to secure the scene." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the cold metal of the handcuffs against his wrists. In the operating room, he was used to being in control, making split-second decisions that saved lives. But here, on his own street, just steps from his front door, he was powerless. Lisa was still on the phone, her voice carrying across the yard. "Yes, Dean Williams, they have him in handcuffs. No, they haven't even checked his ID. Yes, right in front of our house." The night air was getting colder, and Marcus could see his breath forming small clouds in front of his face. The same hands that had performed intricate brain surgery just hours ago were now going numb behind his back. But it was about to get even more complicated, because at that moment, a new police car pulled up, and out stepped someone who would change everything about this situation. A new patrol car parked at the scene, its headlights sweeping across the growing crowd of neighbors. As the door opened, Officer Sarah Martinez stepped out. She had just started her shift when the call came in about a possible robbery suspect being stopped in Ridgewood Heights. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson was still standing handcuffed next to the first police car, watching his wife Lisa arguing with the officers. His arms were starting to ache from being held behind his back, but that wasn't what hurt the most. What pained him deeply was hearing his children's crying from the doorway of their home. "I have an emergency surgery scheduled for 7 a.m. tomorrow," Marcus said calmly to the officer beside him, a 6-year-old boy with a brain tumor. His parents have been waiting 3 months for this operation. "Like I said before, we've heard every excuse," the first officer replied, checking something on his radio. "If you're really a doctor, we'll sort that out at the station." Lisa Thompson was still on her phone, but now she was recording everything while talking to their family lawyer. Her voice was controlled but angry. "Yes, Jim, they still haven't checked his ID. They're ignoring all our neighbors who are telling them who he is." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger. Some were sharing the video they'd recorded, while others were making more phone calls. Tom Wilson, their next-door neighbor, was trying to explain to another officer how he and Marcus had just played golf together last weekend. "Officers," Marcus tried again, "there's a child's life at stake here. Just check my briefcase. My hospital ID, medical license, everything is right there in the car. You can verify who I am in less than a minute." The first officer turned to face Marcus, his flashlight beam hitting Marcus's eyes. "Listen here. You match the description of a suspect who robbed a store 30 minutes ago. Black male, expensive car, wearing fancy clothes. Until we confirm you're not our suspect, you're not going anywhere." Officer Martinez had been watching all this unfold from her car. As she walked closer to the scene, something about the man in handcuffs caught her attention. There was something familiar about his face, but in the chaos of flashing lights and moving people, she couldn't quite place it. "My husband saves lives for a living," Lisa called out, her voice rising with frustration. While you're wasting time here, there's a real criminal getting away somewhere else. Sarah, their young daughter, had moved onto their front porch despite her mother's instructions to stay inside. "Daddy," she cried out. "Why are they doing this to Daddy?" The sound of his daughter's voice made Marcus's chest tighten. "Please," he said quietly to the officers. "You're scaring my children. Just check my ID." Officer Martinez moved closer, trying to get a better look at Marcus's face. The strange feeling of recognition was getting stronger. She pulled out her phone and turned on its flashlight for a better view. That's when it hit her. 3 months ago, her mother had suffered a severe stroke. She remembered sitting in the hospital waiting room, terrified, when a tall, well-dressed doctor had walked out to speak with her family. That doctor had spent hours in surgery, saving her mother's life with his skilled hands, the same hands that were now locked in handcuffs. But before Officer Martinez could say anything, the first officer was already moving Marcus toward the patrol car's back door. "We're going to continue this conversation at the station," he announced. "No," Lisa shouted, moving forward. "You're not taking my husband anywhere without checking his ID first." The tension in the air was electric. Neighbors were recording everything, children were crying, and the red and blue lights kept flashing across the faces of everyone present. And then, just as the situation seemed about to explode, Officer Martinez found her voice. She took a step forward, her face showing sudden recognition. What she was about to say would change everything about this night. "Wait!" Officer Sarah Martinez's voice cut through the chaos. "Stop everything right now." She stepped forward quickly, her face showing a mix of shock and embarrassment. The other officers turned to look at her, surprised by her sudden outburst. "You can't take him to the station," she continued, moving closer to where Marcus stood in handcuffs. "This is Dr. Marcus Thompson. He saved my mother's life." The first officer, whose name tag read Officer Brooks, kept his hand on Marcus's arm. "What are you talking about, Martinez?" Sarah pulled out her phone with slightly shaking hands, quickly finding a photo in her gallery. 3 months ago, my mother had a severe stroke. This man," she pointed at Marcus, "spent 6 hours in surgery saving her life. He's exactly who he says he is." The crowd of neighbors grew quiet, watching the scene unfold. Lisa Thompson had stopped recording and was now standing very still, her phone held tight in her hand. Even the children's crying had softened to quiet sniffles. "Look." Sarah showed her phone to Officer Brooks. The photo showed her smiling with her mother in a hospital room, and there was Marcus in his white coat, standing beside them. "This is from the day my mom was released from the hospital. Dr. Thompson even called to check on her last week." Officer Brooks looked at the photo, then at Marcus, then back at the photo again. His confident expression began to fade. But the robbery suspect description: a black male in expensive clothes and a nice car. Lisa spoke up, her voice sharp. "Do you know how many people that could describe in this neighborhood alone?" Sarah was already walking to Marcus's BMW. "His ID is in his briefcase, right? Let me show you." She reached through the open window and carefully lifted out the black leather briefcase. Opening it, she pulled out Marcus's hospital ID badge and medical license. "Chief of Neurosurgery at Boston General Hospital," she read aloud, holding up the ID for everyone to see. "The same doctor who worked a miracle for my family." The change in the atmosphere was immediate. Officer Brooks quickly produced his keys and began removing Marcus's handcuffs. The metal clicked open, and Marcus slowly brought his arms forward, rubbing his sore wrists. "Dr. Thompson," Officer Brooks started, his voice now completely different. There seems to have been a mistake." Marcus stood tall, adjusting his shirt and tie that had become disheveled during the incident. Despite everything that had just happened, his voice remained calm and professional. "Yes, Officer Brooks, there has been a mistake that could have cost a young boy his life tomorrow morning." Sarah stepped closer, her eyes showing genuine regret. "Dr. Thompson, I'm so sorry I didn't recognize you sooner. Mom talks about you all the time. She calls you her guardian angel." The neighbors began to move closer now that the tension had broken. Tom Wilson put a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. Mrs. Chen was still recording, but now she was narrating in Chinese to her phone, explaining how everything had changed. Lisa had rushed to Marcus's side, checking him over with worried eyes. Their children, seeing the handcuffs removed, finally ran from the porch to join their parents. Sarah, their daughter, wrapped her arms around her father's legs while Michael, their son, tried to look brave despite his red eyes. "Daddy, are you okay?" little Sarah asked, looking up at her father. Marcus picked up his daughter and held her close. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Everything's okay now." But even as he said these words, he knew that things weren't really okay. This incident might be over, but its impact would last much longer. Officer Martinez stepped forward again, this time addressing all the other officers present. "We need to report this incident correctly. This isn't something we can just apologize for and walk away from." As the red and blue lights finally began to shut off one by one, Marcus looked around at the gathered faces, his family, his neighbors, and the officers. He realized that this night would change not just his life, but perhaps the lives of many others in ways no one could have expected. The night air felt different now as the police lights turned off one by one. Marcus Thompson stood surrounded by his family, while Officer Brooks shuffled awkwardly nearby, holding Marcus's hospital ID in his hands. The same ID he had refused to check just minutes earlier. "Dr. Thompson," Officer Brooks began, his voice much softer now, "I need to formally apologize for what happened here tonight. We received a report of a robbery, and in our rush to respond, I made some terrible assumptions." Lisa Thompson still had her phone out, but she wasn't recording anymore. She looked at the officer with stern eyes. "And what exactly were those assumptions, Officer Brooks?" "That a black man in a nice car in a nice neighborhood must be a criminal." Officer Sarah Martinez stepped forward, trying to help manage the situation. "We need to file a complete incident report," she said. "Everything that happened here tonight needs to be properly documented." The neighbors were still watching, though many had lowered their phones. Mrs. Chen walked up to Marcus, holding out a cup of hot tea she had quickly prepared in her house. "Dr. Thompson, you're shaking," she said kindly. "Please, drink this." Marcus accepted the tea with a grateful nod. His hands were indeed shaking slightly, though whether from the cold or the adrenaline, he wasn't sure. His children stayed close to him, little Sarah holding onto his leg while Michael stood brave beside his mother. The boy's surgery, Marcus suddenly remembered, checking his watch. "I need to be at the hospital in 6 hours. This whole incident could have." "I'll personally make sure this doesn't affect your schedule, Dr. Thompson," Officer Martinez interrupted. "I'll speak to the chief myself if needed. That child shouldn't suffer because of our mistake." Tom Wilson, who had been on the phone, approached the group. "Marcus, I got Judge Anderson on the line. He wants to talk to you about what happened here tonight." But before Marcus could respond, the sound of more car engines filled the street. 2 news vans had arrived, their reporters already jumping out with cameras and microphones. Someone had called the media. "Dr. Thompson," one reporter called out, rushing forward. "We received reports of a prominent surgeon being wrongfully detained in his own neighborhood. Can you tell us what happened?" Officer Brooks looked panicked, but Marcus raised his hand calmly. Years of handling high-pressure situations in the operating room had taught him how to stay composed. "I will speak to the press," he said quietly, "but not as a victim, as someone who wants to create change." Lisa squeezed his hand, understanding in her eyes. She had seen that look before, the same expression he had when taking on seemingly impossible cases at the hospital. Marcus was already thinking beyond this incident. "Officers," he turned to Brooks and Martinez, "I could file a complaint. I could call my lawyers right now, but I have a different proposal." The officers looked at him uncertainly. More reporters were gathering, their cameras catching everything. "What if we turned this incident into something positive?" Marcus continued. "What if we used what happened here tonight to create better training programs, to help officers recognize and overcome their biases?" Officer Martinez's eyes lit up. "Like the community outreach program we've been trying to start?" Marcus nodded. "Exactly. But with real experiences, real stories, starting with mine." The reporters were moving closer, their microphones extended, but Marcus raised his voice to address everyone present: the officers, the neighbors, the media, and his family. "Tonight could have ended very differently," he said clearly, "but instead of letting it divide us, let's use it to bring about real change. Not just for this neighborhood, but for every neighborhood where someone might be judged by their appearance rather than their character." As he spoke these words, Marcus could see the impact they had on everyone around him. Even Officer Brooks, who had been avoiding eye contact, looked up with a mix of shame and hope on his face. 1 month had passed since that tense night in front of Marcus Thompson's house. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the police department's training room, where Marcus stood before a group of 30 police officers. Some were new recruits, others were veterans, but all watched intently as he shared his story. That night, I wasn't seen as Dr. Marcus Thompson, chief of neurosurgery, he explained, his voice calm but firm. I wasn't seen as a father, a husband, or a neighbor. I was seen as a description: black male in an expensive car. Officer Brooks sat in the front row, looking very different from the aggressive officer he'd been that night. He had become one of the strongest supporters of the new training program, often sharing his own perspective on what had gone wrong. Dr. Thompson could have sued the department, Brooks told his fellow officers. Instead, he chose to help us become better. That's something I'll never forget. At the back of the room, Officer Sarah Martinez was taking notes. After that night, she had been appointed to lead the department's new community relations unit. The story of how she recognized Marcus as her mother's surgeon had become a powerful example of why officers needed to look beyond their first impressions. The training session was part of a new program called Beyond the Badge, which Marcus had helped design. It brought community members together with police officers to share experiences and break down barriers. Today's session focused on racial profiling and its impact on families and communities. The young boy I was supposed to operate on that next morning? Marcus continued, showing a photo on the screen behind him. This is him now, 1 month after his successful surgery. His name is Tommy, and he's back in school, playing with his friends. The photo showed a smiling 6-year-old boy with a small scar hidden under his hair. The officers in the room shifted in their seats, understanding how differently things could have turned out. If Officer Martinez hadn't recognized me, if the situation hadn't been resolved, Tommy might not have had his surgery that morning. One wrong assumption could have changed his entire life. In the weeks following the incident, the story had made national news. Other police departments had reached out, wanting to learn more about the training program. Marcus had received hundreds of letters from people sharing similar experiences, thanking him for speaking up. Lisa Thompson, who sat at the side of the room, watched her husband with pride. She had helped develop the legal aspects of the training program, ensuring it addressed both police procedures and civil rights. Their children had even contributed, making a video about how they felt seeing their father in handcuffs that night. But this isn't about placing blame, Marcus said, walking closer to the officers. This is about creating change. Every person in this room has the power to make different choices, to look beyond their first assumptions. He clicked to the next slide, showing a series of photos. A black teenager in a hoodie who turned out to be a math genius, a Latino man in work clothes who was actually a business owner, a Muslim woman in a hijab who was a leading cancer researcher. These are all members of our community, Marcus explained. Each of them has been judged by their appearance. Each of them has a story that goes far deeper than what you see at first glance. The officers were taking notes, asking questions, and truly engaging with the material. This wasn't just another required training session, it was a real conversation about change. At the end of the session, Officer Brooks stood up to address his colleagues. A month ago, I made the biggest mistake of my career, but thanks to Dr. Thompson's forgiveness and guidance, that mistake has turned into an opportunity for all of us to grow. As Marcus packed up his presentation materials, he smiled at the group of officers who stayed behind to talk more. What had started as one of the worst nights of his life had somehow grown into something powerful and positive, a chance for real change in his community. 6 months after that fateful night, Marcus Thompson stood at a podium in front of the graduating class of the police academy. The auditorium was packed with new officers, their families, and community leaders. The same stage that had hosted countless routine graduation ceremonies was now the setting for something truly special. When I was handcuffed outside my home that night, Marcus began, adjusting the microphone. I had two choices. I could let anger consume me, or I could turn that moment into something meaningful. Today, looking at all of you, I know we made the right choice. In the front row sat his family, Lisa, Michael, and Sarah. His daughter was wearing a special t-shirt that read, "My dad makes a difference." Next to them sat Officer Sarah Martinez and her mother, Mrs. Martinez, who had fully recovered from her stroke thanks to Marcus's surgery. The Beyond the Badge program has now trained over 500 officers, Marcus continued. But more importantly, it has brought our community together in ways we never expected. The statistics displayed on the screen behind him told an impressive story. Complaints about racial profiling had dropped by 60% in their district. Community trust in law enforcement had increased significantly. Other cities were starting to adopt their training program. Officer Brooks, now promoted to training supervisor, stood up to share his part of the story. Dr. Thompson taught us that being a good police officer isn't just about enforcing the law, he said. It's about seeing the whole person, the whole community. The changes went beyond just police training. Local schools had started inviting officers and community members to speak to students. Business owners had created a mentorship program for young people. The walls between different parts of the community were slowly coming down. Mrs. Chen, Marcus's neighbor who had recorded the incident that night, was now running a successful YouTube channel about police-community relations. Her videos, translated into multiple languages, helped immigrant communities better understand their rights and build trust with law enforcement. But the real heroes, Marcus said, gesturing to the graduating class, are sitting right here. You chose to learn from our experience. You chose to be part of the solution. He clicked to the next slide, showing a recent photo of Tommy, the young boy whose brain surgery had been scheduled for the morning after the incident. The boy was playing baseball, fully recovered, his parents beaming beside him. Life gives us moments that test who we are, Marcus continued. That night tested all of us, the officers, my family, our community. But look what we built from that test. The camera crews from local news stations filmed as Marcus invited Officer Martinez and Officer Brooks to join him on stage. The three of them stood together, a living symbol of how conflict could transform into cooperation. To the graduating class, Marcus addressed the new officers directly. You're entering law enforcement at a crucial time. Every interaction you have with the public is an opportunity to either build trust or break it. Choose wisely. Lisa Thompson stood up, holding a large envelope. And to help you choose wisely, she announced, we're providing every graduate with a scholarship for additional community relations training. The audience erupted in applause. Marcus looked out at the sea of faces, black, white, brown, young, old, officers and civilians, all united in this moment of hope and change. As the ceremony concluded, little Sarah ran up to give her father a hug. Officer Martinez's mother joined them, the woman whose life Marcus had saved now helping to save other lives in a different way. Dr. Thompson, a young graduate, approached him. My brother was racially profiled last year. Your program helped me understand both sides. Thank you for not giving up on us. Marcus shook the young officer's hand, remembering the cold metal of handcuffs 6 months ago. That moment of humiliation and fear had transformed into something powerful, a movement for change that would impact generations to come. As he walked off stage with his family, Marcus knew that while one night had changed his life, the ripples from that change would continue to spread far beyond anything he could have imagined.